Hello and welcome to Medicine Without Cruelty. I'm Savita, founder of Medicine Without Cruelty. We are a non-profit organization dedicated to providing evidence and providing information about, living an animal-free reality. Today I have with me Ronnie Lee. Ronnie is probably best known for being one of the founders of the Animal Liberation Front and for having spent about 9 years in prison for ALF activities. In more recent years, though, he has turned his attention to vegan outreach and frequently speaks of the importance of vegan education and of local vegan activist groups and for the achievement of animal liberation. So thank you so much. Ronnie, what brought you to founding the ALF movement here in the UK?
Well, actually, what happened, I became vegan in the spring of 1972, and that wasn't enough for me. I wanted to be an activist. And so I got involved with Hunt Sabs and started my own Hunt Sab group where I lived at the time in Luton. But there was a form of hunting that we weren't really able to do much about. The Hunt Sabs is mainly about trying to interrupt the pursuit of a fox or another wild by the hounds, and they use various methods to do that. But there's a type of hunting, or really it's not really even hunting, it's kind of slaughter of young foxes, fox cubs, that takes place in the early part of the hunting season around about August, where basically they just send the dogs into a wood to massacre the young foxes to kind of train, give the dogs a taste of blood. And we found that was very, very difficult to sabotage.
Yeah.
And so the few of us started thinking, what can we do about that? And we had a meeting of 6 of us. We had a meeting in London about it, and we decided that what we would do is we'd go to the hunt kennels in the early hours of the morning before one of these cub hunts, and we'd damage their vehicles so they couldn't actually go and say, cool, you see. So we couldn't do that as a Hunt Sab, so we thought we needed to form a different organisation and have a different name. So initially we called ourselves the Band of Mercy, which sounds like a rather strange name, but it was
like Robin Hood.
Yeah, it was the name of an RSPCA youth group, or a name given to, there were various bands of mercy that were RSPCA youth groups in the 19th century. Just about when the RSPCA was formed, and they're really quite militant. They used to take direct action, these young people, and cause damage to guns used by shooters and things like that. So we thought we'd like to revive the spirit of that, and so we decided to call ourselves the same name. But then the name was changed 3 years later in 1976. The name was changed to the Animal Liberation Front, and we also very quickly decided not just to focus on hunting, but to take direct action against all forms of the oppression of other animals. And so we attempted to destroy a vivisection laboratory that was being built in Milton Keynes.
Yeah.
And we damaged a couple of boats used for seal hunting up on the Wash in Lincolnshire. So it wasn't just, we weren't just kind of focused on fox hunting. Our activities covered a wide range of different ways in which other animals are oppressed.
So I'm quite new to the animal rights, animal advocacy, you could call it, movement. So there's probably a couple of things that me and probably our viewers probably want some definitions on. Firstly, vivisection is essentially any operation or any procedure that's performed on a live animal. I guess people probably now don't use that word so often. I don't often hear it these days.
Originally, it was meant to just refer to the cutting of an animal, section, the cutting, but then it became used to refer to all animal experiments. In fact, way before the 1970s, the word was being used. There were 2 organisations here in England, the National Anti-Vivisection Society and the British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection, and they existed for decades before the 1970s. So that the word has really quite a history. The BAV's changed its name now. They're now known as Cruelty Free International. I think the National Anti-Vivisection Society is still the same, as far as I know.
It's funny, isn't it? Because Cruelty Free International, I feel like the term cruelty free, when it comes to especially the cosmetics industry, everyone knows what cruelty-free means. I wonder a lot about language that we use these days. And it kind of goes back to, us putting it mildly, what is happening to the animals within a laboratory. And you often hear the words, oh, we make sure that we provide minimal suffering to the animal. We provide, think about animal welfare. And no, any sort of procedure that's performed on an animal will cause them harm. Being locked in that cage is going to cause them psychological suffering. And so, maybe we should go back to the old ways, calling a spade, call it vivisection.
Well, the fundamental wrong is the oppression and exploitation of the other animals. How much actual suffering they undergo is kind of secondary. I mean, humans should not be using other animals for our own purposes in the first place, really, in any way whatsoever.
Yeah.
And so then if that use involves suffering, that's an additional aspect to it. But the fundamental wrong is the exploitation of those animals, or the oppression of those animals. That's the fundamental wrong, because of course the people who carry out the experiment will say, oh no, we anesthetize the animals, they don't feel anything, they're painlessly put to sleep. And obviously that isn't true. There's horrendous suffering in laboratories, and if that was done to humans, it would amount to torture. It'd be classified torture. It is torture. But even if their claims were correct and the animals didn't suffer, it would still be wrong. It would still be wrong to use those animals and to kill those animals, for the purposes of humans. So it's really the use and the oppression that's the fundamental wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of coming to the second part of your career, veganism. If you think about it, you cannot be a vegan and still live an unkind life in other ways. Because I remember when we had a phone call probably about last year, and we were talking about how, I know quite a few people who work laboratories and are still party to that oppression, whether it's through the research they do, the products they are using, and they still call themselves vegan or vegetarian, saying that they do not use animals or animal products. And I just remember what you said about it, and I'd love for you to talk about it.
Fundamentally, if someone works in a laboratory and is party to animal experimentation, they cannot be a vegan. They cannot be a vegan. You see, veganism isn't a diet. I mean, obviously the diet, the food is a really important part of it, but fundamentally it's a philosophy. I mean, Donald Watson, who founded the Vegan Society, said that veganism was a philosophy that was opposed to the exploitation of all sentient life. So it's opposition to exploitation, and I'd say oppression as well, because it's it would be inconsistent to be just opposed to the exploitation and not be opposed to oppression at the same time. And so any exploitation of other animals is inconsistent with veganism. It's not, someone who exploits animals in any way cannot be a vegan. They might eat a plant diet or a plant-based diets, but they can't be vegan. And one of the problems is that, there are a lot of people who really these days misunderstand the meaning of veganism and what it means to be vegan. And I think there's a lot of education, needs to be done with regard to that.
Yeah, I completely agree. I found it really crazy. I remember going in, must be my second year of my degree, and being really disturbed at the fact that animals were still being used in laboratories, because it's a bit of a shock to us. And you think we would know about it in secondary school, but no, it's probably more kind of highlighted when you get to university level. And I remember meeting someone, and she worked within the animal laboratory, and she told me that I make sure that I do not eat any animal. I am vegetarian. I do not, even though I am doing this here at work, I don't feel the necessary. It was shocking at that time. You just think, oh, okay, she's trying to reduce it as much as possible. And now I look back on those conversations, being enlightened by yourself, and, the animal free movement that is there, after hearing all of this, it just shocks me how wrong it is. And I kind of wish I could go back and, have the words to, really, really give her a talking to. What are you doing?
Well, I think it's important that people, understand the true meaning of veganism. I came across somebody like that. I said, do you understand what veganism means? Do you understand what it truly means to be vegan? Do you know what the founders of the vegan movement intended veganism to be? Because if we're going to look for a definition of what veganism is, we have to go back to what the people who founded veganism, founded the vegan movement, intended it to be. We can't just make it up.
Mm.
Aware of any of that, and they tend to think it's just about food and it's just about diets. And it's not, it's about far more than that. I mean, obviously, the food is a very important part of it. And I mean the exploitation and oppression of other animals by the food industry is absolutely horrendous. I think it's about 8 billion other animals are slaughtered every year to feed the UK population. Worldwide, it's 50,000 other animals a second killed, to feed humans, when it's all totally unnecessary. We can live perfectly well on a vegan diet. And so it's really important for people to stop eating animal products. That's a big aspect of it. But it's not the only. That isn't what veganism is all about. It's a far bigger idea and a far bigger concept than that.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. No, I think people who are listening are definitely going to have the eyes and ears.
Well, I don't anyone listening to become vegan. If someone becomes vegan, adopts a vegan diet, that equates to the sparing of almost 100 animals every year. Here in the UK, every person who consumes animal products on average is responsible for the slaughter of almost 100 animals a year through animals that are obviously, killed to feed them, or in the process of feeding them. So just that is a huge step. How could we spare 100 animals from slaughter and suffering? Because most of it does involve horrendous suffering as well as the the fundamental wrong, which is the exploitation and killing of those animals. What else? What other form of animal protection activity could we do that spares that many animals? It's such an important thing to. And this is why I think vegan outreach is so important. It's so important that as many vegans as possible, or I think probably almost all vegans, could be involved in spreading the vegan message and involved in outreach. Because if we educate just one other person to be vegan, then we've spared almost 100 animals a year from suffering and slaughter. And I think if we're active in vegan outreach, we educate far more than just one person to become vegan.
Is that what motivated you to kind of move away from, say, the anti-vivisection? So how did that transition come about?
Well, basically, what actually happened was, if you go back, we talk about the birth of the animal rights movement, and really it kind of arose. It arose here in the UK, and obviously the concepts spread throughout the world. But it arose in the 1970s, and that was when the word speciesism was coined by Richard Ryder, who was a professor at Oxford University. And he wrote an anti-vivisection book actually called Victims of Science, which was focused on animal experimentation, a couple of years, some years before that. But it was mainly in that book that it featured Victims of Science. And people might want to get hold of a copy of that and read it if they can find a copy of it. I think it's published in about 1975, so it's quite a long time ago. And then you had the idea of animal rights. The Animal Liberation Fronts arose in the 1970s. So it was kind of this kind of hotbed of change, really, and kind of people becoming more radical and becoming really more militant as well in their activities in the 1970s. But and of course the Vegan Society existed as well. Then the Vegan Society was formed in 1944, but the Vegan Society is more existed to kind of really help people who want to become vegan. Give help and advice. They didn't really. They weren't very much a campaigning organisation in terms of really campaign for veganism. We were all campaigning on what might be referred to as single issues. Anti-vivisection, against the fur trade, against hunting, and that's what happened. And then the Animal Liberation Front arose, and the Animal Liberation Front, really had a great deal of success in our actions against the vivisection industry. Actually, I'd say they were responsible for hugely reducing the number of animal experiments that took place every year. I think because of the pressure that it put on the industry. And the other big success here in the UK for the Animal Liberation Front was against the fur trade, where ALF actions took place against fur shops and department stores that sold fur, and it resulted in a massive decline in the fur trade, to the point that the only, I mean, obviously fur farming was banned here in the UK in the early 2000s, but fur can still be sold here. It's still it's still to be imported and to be sold, and that's a loophole.
But there are quite a few of those loopholes around here.
There are a lot. I mean, there's lots of loopholes. I mean, a huge example of something that's full of loopholes is, of course, the Hunting Act that was supposed to ban fox hunting, and actually hasn't really done so. But going back to the fur trade, the only department store now that sells fur is Harrods in London, and the only high street fur shops that exist in the whole of the UK are just in London, in a certain part of London. So all these towns and cities that had fur shops and had department stores that sold fur, had fur departments. That's all gone, and a lot of that really was to do with the Animal Liberation Front. So the ALF had a lot of success, and obviously, that resulted in millions of animals being spared, from slaughter and suffering in most cases. And then, of course, what happened is the authorities, through various methods, kind of cracked down on the ALF, and a lot of people were sent to prison, as indeed I was. But actually, hundreds of activists spent time in prison, and new laws were brought in, and a big kind of problem for that sort of action these days is surveillance. We have surveillance everywhere, but way back in the 70s, 80s, into the 90s, say, there wasn't the surveillance, there wasn't the CCTV that you've got now, and a lot of places there, the security, wasn't very great because of the expense. But now in the digital age, it's so cheap to have cameras and CCTVs everywhere. So the chances of, doing an ALF are very, very small these days.
Right.
So you just couldn't get away, with that sort of activity now like you used to.
Right.
So there's all the reasons why the ALF went into decline. But a major problem, I mean, apart from that, major problem with the ALF was that it was kind of, although it spared a very large number of animals, it could never actually achieve animal liberation in terms of, the widespread animal liberation, where we have have a society, other animals are no longer oppressed or exploited in where it's like that's how the world is, where that it's widespread animal liberation. The ALF could never achieve that, because you're never going to achieve animal liberation where most people don't believe in it. You can't. How can that happen? And where most people are like speciesist in their outlook and they're human supremacists in their outlook, you're never going to get widespread animal liberation. So the only way you're going to achieve that is through education, through getting people to change the way that their mindset, change their attitudes. And that's why I believe that vegan education is fundamental to the achievement of animal liberation.
Wow, that's some journey you've been on throughout your life.
Yeah, I mean, I've always wanted animal liberation. My aim's to achieve animal liberation. So I've always been looking for what's the best way of doing that. Through my experience, over the years, I've come to the conclusion that I mean, there's all sorts of ways in which people are campaigning for other animals and helping other animals. But my view is that unless whatever people do in terms of advocating for other animals, in terms of animal rescue, whatever people do, unless we have widespread vegan education, unless we have widespread vegan outreach, we're not going to achieve animal liberation. And so it's this is why I'm constantly urging vegans to get involved in outreach in whatever way they can. I mean, there's lots of different ways people can do it, and that's why that's always my message, because I see that as vital to the achievement of animal liberation.
Fantastic. Yeah, I agree. I see your point. Can I ask, do you think protesting still has the same effect it had back in the day? You mentioned the fur trade, and what do you think in today's climate? Protesting still the one?
I kind of think I think it depends on the type of protest. I think quite often protests can be equivalent of hitting your head against a brick wall. If you look at the climate protests there have been, where people have caused disruption, the effect of that on this government hasn't been to make them take measures to effectively combat the climate crisis. What they've done instead, they're still carrying on, doing things that are making the climate crisis worse. and promoting promoting like the opening of new oil fields and all that kind of thing. Whereas at the same time they brought in more draconian measures against protests. So that it could be argued that those disruptive activities have actually had the opposite effect to what they're intended. And because the trouble is that you're trying to put pressure on a government that's totally ideologically opposed to what you're asking. That's the difficulty. And so you're kind of like constantly just sort of banging your head against a brick wall. And so really, fundamentally, you've got to look at, how do we change the government? How do we, get a government that's actually going to be sympathetic to what?
Yeah.
It's getting me back to vegan outreach, because the more vegans we have, the more vegan politicians we have, because some of those vegans will want to become politicians. And I mean, I never want to be a politician, but I kind of, really appreciate when vegans want to be politicians. And I do kind of campaign for vegan politicians and try and get them elected, ones that are around my local area, because I think it's important. We'd have more vegan politicians, but we'd also have more vegans to vote for those politicians. So you can change the nature of the administration and, eventually vote in an administration that's much more sympathetic, veganism and to protecting other animals across the board. And so once again, that comes back to vegan outreach. It's it's obviously something that kind of can't be done quickly, but it's better to do. It's better to be on the right road, even though that's a long road. It's still better to be on the right road than to not be on the right road.
Yeah, I agree in part, but I also think, the phrase "all roads lead to Rome." I don't necessarily think it's just one road that's going to achieve animal liberation. We need to celebrate all of our strengths. I think I bring, my unique talents to the table, and I love listening to you as well. So it's great to have you. I was just thinking, when you mentioned about vegan politicians, I remembered we have a debate coming up on the 19th of February, and it's on the back of the petition animal testing should be banned. So this is for the safety testing of a wide range of chemicals which are currently done on animals. And people often think it's just rats and mice, but no, they are still testing these chemicals on dogs as well. And that's currently being done here in the UK. If we have more vegans and we have more vegan outreach, it stands to reason we should have more vegans kind of pestering our MPs to, whilst they might not be vegans themselves, perhaps look at the issues that their constituents are raising. So do you think, maybe in part your work with vegan outreach might put more pressure on the government? What do you think?
I think it could, but I think the difficulty is that where you've got a government that's entrenched in a certain ideology, that whatever pressure you put on them is very unlikely to make a difference. I mean, remember when there was a huge protest in London way back at the time of the Iraq War, where the UK, it was planned that the UK would join the USA in invading Iraq, and there was a huge protest over this kind of made up thing about the weapons of mass destruction that didn't actually exist, but there we are. And there was huge protests in London. I think it was 2 million people protested against the UK involvement in the Iraq War. It made no difference. Tony Blair still sent the troops to Iraq, despite 2 million people protesting, because that was his ideology. That was the ideology of that government. I mean, obviously that was a Labour government, but they're far from being, Labour are never as bad as the Tories with regard to other animals, but they're still not. It's not great at all. But so that's the problem. That so often, no matter how many people protest, if you're up against a government with an entrenched ideology, it's very unlikely to make any difference. So we've kind of, and it's almost like, I don't know if you've seen the film Groundhog Day, where somebody keeps repeating that. It's like the idea of repeating the same mistakes over and over and over again, and condemned to always have the same outcome. And I've got a cat here that's just nibbled me.
The cat's saying
she wants me to stroke her, and she'll bite my arm to get attention. So I'll have to stroke her with one hand while I'm talking to you, keep myself safe. So, and I think that's kind of tends to be what's kind of happened over the years. People have said, oh, well, we don't like this, so let's protest. And so often, in almost all cases, it doesn't achieve anything. You're up against this irresistible force, and what we've got to think, we've got to think a little bit deeper and think, well, look, instead of bashing our heads constantly against this brick wall, how do we remove the brick wall? How do we remove that brick wall? How do you make it so that we can get through that brick wall? And how you make it so you get through that brick wall is the politicians. I think, trying to get this lot to do anything decent, it's a lost cause. And so how do you change the politicians? And so once again, you've kind of got to change the sort of culture of society, really, in order to change the politics. And you change the culture through changing individuals, and you change individuals through human outreach. And all right, so it's a kind of, it's a longer term strategy, but I think it's one that kind of has much more chance of working. I'm not saying all protest is unsuccessful. I think protests can succeed, or perhaps what looks like protests can succeed, where it contains an element of education.
Yeah.
And I can give you an example of that. That myself and my wife Louise, for about 13 years, we were involved in a campaign called Greyhound Action, which was a campaign against the dog racing industry. We adopted a greyhound, and we found out about all the dogs that had been killed, because of the dog racing industry. There wasn't a campaign here in the UK against it, and we thought, right, we'll start one off. It kind of got really big. We sort of ran that from the end of the 70s to the kind of early 2000s, I think. End of the 90s, sorry, not 70s, end of the 90s to about 13 years. And then other people took it over and sort of really took it to new heights, to be honest. And we had all these local groups that would stage like protests outside dog traps. But the protests were education. In fact, I'd probably call them demonstrations rather than protests, because what they were trying to do was educate the people going into the dog racing about what happened to the dogs, about how the dogs were killed by the dog racing industry, you see. So the attendances at the dog tracks went down, you see, and that was a very successful campaign, and it contributed to a lot of these tracks closing, and then that had a knock-on effect of like fewer greyhounds being bred, for the industry, so fewer greyhounds were then killed, you see. And so people would say, oh, that's that looks like a protest, so people there with placards and stuff like that, but really it was more of an education effect, because it was aimed at the ordinary people, asking them not to support the dog racing. So I think that kind of protest or that kind of demonstration can be effective, but you've kind of and then I think also you have these protests outside some of the stores that have kind of continued to sell fur in a small way, like fur trimmings on hats and fur gloves and stuff like that. Places like flannels, I think Canada Goose as well. I think those can be effective, because basically they're educating the public. They're saying to the public, don't shop here because they sell fur. So those stores are going to think we're going to lose money. People aren't going to shop here at all because we're selling fur. So, point of view of money making, it's better to not sell fur. So I think that type of protest or demonstration can be effective, but I think very, very often they're not. And I think we have to, carefully think about, what protests are effective and what ones aren't, really.
Yeah.